the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen. And
I'm Megan Figueroa. Woohoo! I mean, I don't feel it. That was so fake.
Yeah. Yes. It's been a march. It's not quite finished, but we're getting close.
Yeah, it's been a 2021.
Yeah. I mean, things are moving along. You guys are like now vaccinating everyone over the age of 16 and above, so that's good.
We are. Yeah, Arizona's doing well in that regard.
And meanwhile, I think my parents are eligible next week. Yeah, so it's much slower here.
Yeah, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, it's all right. I mean, for a long time we weren't getting any vaccines, and now we are, and you know, they're slowly ramping up. At least, I don't really know how the rest of the provinces and territories are doing it, but in BC, it's going every day another year lower. So that means every year there's more people. And so that means they're slowly ramping up in terms of capacity. So it's still hopeful.
It's funny because someone tweeted at us that they were listening to a previous episode, and it happened to be when we were talking about the flu.
Oh, yeah.
A previous year's flu. It happened to be that I said that I really was afraid of getting the flu that year.
Mm-hmm.
And so what a time capsule moment. Because I think we had mentioned just our January episode how strange it's going to be to listen back to these intros.
Yes.
And during COVID.
And that was an intro from pre-COVID, so it was
right,
still weird.
To listen to pre-COVID. And to be like, oh, the flu. Although that can be very serious and very dangerous.
No, absolutely. Like we could have another pandemic that's a flu instead of a coronavirus.
Yeah.
In fact, it's more likely to be a flu. So, yay. Hopefully we've learned some lessons, like, hey, maybe wearing a mask is a good idea if there's something going around. Maybe flu season, we should just all wear masks.
I mean, I have a set of super cute masks now. You know, I'm not going to just throw them away. I like the idea of wearing them if I have to go to doctor's office type places where there truly are sick people.
Yes, hospitals should require them from now on. So it'll be interesting to see just like what small changes, what tweaks we make after all of this is said and done, which feels like we're getting closer. And so it's like, oh my God, when is it going to happen? But of course, we've got a long way to go because the whole world needs to be vaccinated before we're really safe.
But we're getting safer, and we talked about this too. I think in the January episode, how, like, language is changing. I'll be interested to see what sticks around. I think a lot of the Zoom stuff will stick around.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Certainly today, I'm feeling a little Zoom fatigue, so I think that's definitely going to stick around as a term. So yeah.
Yeah, don't love the Zoom. I mean, it's very useful. It serves many purposes. It's great. And yet...
I mean, how many lovely people have we met during quarantine via Zoom for interviews for the pod?
Right.
So thank you. Thank you, Zoom, for that. Yeah, it's been so exciting, the new interviews that we have coming out.
Yeah.
I mean, we have so many in the... queue that I'm so excited about that I just want to tell everyone about.
I know, I can't wait. Yeah.
But before that, still speaking about the here and now.
Yeah, the same thing as last time. Lots of anti-Asian racism. This time, I mean, it was always there, obviously, but the fact that 6 women, Asian women or women of Asian descent, were murdered at massage parlors, and plus 2 other people who one white woman and one, I think it was a Latino man?
No, he was the husband, right?
That's right. There were 8 victims, and obviously the targets were the Asian women or women of Asian descent. So that's gross. And the way that people have been talking about it, like,
yeah.
Oh. He tried to blame it on sex addiction, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, the mental and verbal gymnastics happening to not say hate crime have been...
And even if, let's say for the sake of argument, it wasn't racist, how is it still not a hate crime against women? It's just... Of course it's racially motivated, of course. But even if you take that away, it's still a hate crime. And it bugs me so much that, like... I don't know, the way we talk about all these things is just so disturbing.
It is, and then we have that kind of prepackaged statement that, oh, this is not who we are, which is so disingenuous.
I know. It's kind of the job of leaders to say we're better than this, but
yeah.
I mean, you're right, it's disingenuous to say that.
It's more aspirational.
It's aspirational, and, you know, people should want their country to be better, but, like, you have to kind of admit that it's not first, and that's the step that's always missing, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. Asian American lawmakers, I guess it was about a week ago now, in the House Judiciary Committee, warned that we're at a crisis point, and they mentioned language specifically. So Representative Ted Lieu of California says, I am asking you to please stop using racist terms like Kung Flu or Wuhan virus or other ethnic identifiers in describing this virus. I am not a virus, and when you say things like that, it hurts the Asian American community. Whatever political points you think you're scoring by using ethnic identifiers in describing the virus, you're harming Americans who happen to be of Asian descent.
Yep.
Which, I mean, 100%. And he was saying this to Representative Chip Roy of Texas, and this is ridiculous. Chip Roy says that, okay, so he says, my concern about this hearing is it seems to want to venture into the policing of rhetoric. And then he goes on to say that we need more justice and less thought policing.
Oh.
I know.
Is he also the one who is like, we should basically get a long rope?
Yeah, there's an old saying in Texas about, you know, find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree. Yeah.
Yeah, way to invoke lynching.
Right, yeah.
For a crime that I bet he would say has nothing to do with race. Like, come on. Like, the whole thing is just layers of grossness.
Yeah. It's just, the thought policing, the policing of rhetoric. We see different versions of this all the time against Black women, other people of color, Indigenous people.
Yeah.
I can't even believe anyone wouldn't agree or, you know, give Ted Lieu the benefit of the doubt because he's speaking as a member of the community that's hurting. But just to, like, stay quiet for 1 second instead of being, like, actively malicious.
Right.
In what you're saying back to someone who's hurting is just so inconceivable to me. So cruel.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think for people like us, we struggle to understand, like, why people would go out of their way to hurt someone.
Yeah.
I understand better people accidentally doing it.
Yes.
Because we've all done it, and we all, you know, say things that are unkind that we don't mean. But, like, to actually go out of your way to be cruel to another human being is really hard to understand, I think, for people like us who are not actively malicious.
Well, and our listeners, we're talking to people that are accidentally saying things that might be hurtful, just like you and me.
Like, we've all done it.
We're all learned, you know, things that might be that are related to language. But we're never going to get across to people that are maliciously using language, purposefully gaslighting people, using slurs because they want to feel powerful.
No, it's really hard to actually get through to people like them, which is why I don't bother. Because, like, some people might be able to get through to them, but I just don't think that unless they're, like, a relative of mine, maybe in that case, but not necessarily, maybe I might be able to get through to them. But if we're strangers, I'm not the right person to tell them.
Yeah, so obviously we, as non-Asian American or Asian Canadian or of Asian descent, I don't know what to say besides I will continue trying in the ways that I can.
Yeah, we'll keep fighting against, I guess, the more casual forms of racism that people might slip into, because that's where we can fight the best, is to remind us ourselves and other people that being careless with language can help lead to these kinds of outcomes where people are murdered.
Yep.
Like, the words themselves don't kill, but they allow for other people to think it's okay.
Yeah, like, I think that sometimes people might think we're being hyperbolic when we say that language is harmful, a certain language is harmful, or dangerous. I mean it literally. This is dangerous. You know, there are some times when it's very, very dangerous, and I think this is a perfect example.
Yeah, Nazi rhetoric is extremely dangerous. Fascist rhetoric is extremely dangerous because it lays the ground for fascism, right? And this is a very similar type of thing, like letting racist ideology run free. Anti-sex worker rhetoric, anti-women rhetoric, all of it in this toxic soup. It's all allows for someone to say to themselves, oh, it's okay for me to kill these people. And then there's the gun access issue.
At least you're in Canada now. Lucky you.
It's a whole complicated thing. I am really upset, and I'm thinking of everyone who's indirectly or directly affected by this violence.
Me too. And I hope those of us who aren't will be thoughtful about what has happened and think about how we can be better or help or do better or all of that.
Yes. We all need to be trying a little bit harder, I think. Anyway. So today's episode, we wanted to get this out now because their book is coming out. So we're kind of excited to have this come out around the time that their book comes out. And it's about standardized language, standardized language ideology in higher education. So it's a little bit more niche maybe, but it still applies to everybody. That, you know, if all these ideologies are still maintained in higher ed, then what does it tell us about the rest of the world? So.
Absolutely. So enjoy.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, so today we're happy to have two guests. We have Dr. Galen Clements, who is a visiting assistant professor of linguistics at Duke University, and Dr. Marnie Jo Pitre, associate professor in TESOL and graduate TESOL program coordinator / director in the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania. And they are the co-editors of Linguistic Discrimination in U.S. Higher Education, Changing Prejudice, and the Impact of Language and Dialect on University Campuses. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I saw the title of your edited volume, and of course my first thought was this should have happened so long ago. Like, not on you, but like why, you know, these issues have been so relevant for so long. So I'm so glad that y'all did this.
Yeah, so let's begin right with, like, why did you want to edit this volume?
It came out actually of a panel that through Linguistics and Higher Education Committee at the Linguistic Society of America, we had come up with this idea and really wanted to do something that we saw happening on the higher ed campus, but also something that many of us had experienced. Myself and other colleagues have said, well, you know, as a Southerner or as a woman, or I've seen students and I've witnessed that, you know, with them and other professors. And it would be really nice if we could address that and have just a variety of people who've done some different work on that. And so after the panel, actually, an editor from Routledge came up and said, hey, really interested in this, can we meet? And so it just kind of came about really organically that way. But I think one of the reasons we chose the topic in the first place, particularly for me, is not only have I witnessed other people, but certainly as a Southerner myself and as a woman, and the higher you go sometimes in things, you get that prejudice against you and the way you speak, or people ask you to repeat yourselves. And and it's out there and students have it. And then, of course, in the news, like you said, there are so many stories about people having to sue their employers, or, incidences at universities and things like that, where we see these things happen. And it's kind of a fine line, because universities can require a medium of instruction or a language, and we're looking for professional language, and we're often talking about things like a written form or academic English and things like that. And sometimes that's fine to require those things, but when we become biased against only those and only preferring those, that's when we see people being treated differently or not given the opportunities. Maybe they didn't get that promotion, or that student didn't get that internship opportunity, or things like that. And so actually, after the panel and talking to Mr. Sundry at Rutledge, Taylor, and Francis, I came home, and a university in North Carolina 2 weeks later had a particular incident about students speaking Chinese in hallways and, kind of in the common rooms of a particular program. And they were told to stop, and they were told that that wouldn't look good, and they should be practicing English as much as they can. And they weren't given a space to communicate with each other in a way they felt comfortable. And so it just reiterated the fact that we really needed to get this out there.
What do they mean, doesn't look good? It doesn't look good to who? Who's caring about this?
In that particular situation, there were some professors. And the professor said, and you can look this up on CNN, it actually was responded to by the Chinese education minister. He likened it to, what if American students came to Chinese schools and we told them they can never speak English, right? It's the same thing, right? And so the professors went so far as to go into the graduate office of that particular program and ask to see the pictures of the students in that program so they could identify. So if the students asked them to write a recommendation later for an internship or a study opportunity, they would know who to say no to.
Oh my, Carrie, what's my face doing?
I think both of us are shocked. And normally I'm not as shocked as Megan, but today I'm as shocked as Megan.
And of course, Gail's anecdote is about higher education, but the history of students not being able to use another language besides English in the classroom, for example, suffering, not just, verbal types of bias, but actually being beaten, or, the history of people being forbidden to use their language of home has a long history in our country, unfortunately. So.
Oh yeah, my dad was beaten for speaking Spanish in kindergarten in Arizona. So absolutely. And a lot of people didn't actually know that. When I brought that up a couple of times in my PhD program, people were shocked. It's happening still in some ways. I don't know if it, even corporally, so it's awful. But
even though that's illegal.
Illegal, yeah. The anecdote that, so that was at North Carolina University, you said? Or where was this?
It was a higher ed in North Carolina.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember the kind of, I guess I didn't look into it too deeply, which surprises me, but I thought it was kind of this quote unquote benevolent racism, basically, where they're like, no, don't do that because we want you to succeed. But for them to actually be like, I'm not going to write you a recommendation letter.
Yeah, that's punitive.
Turned. What a turn.
It seems very subversive, right? And like I said, it is this weird tightrope. I've mentioned that to Marty and used that same kind of picture for other people, because our job is to make sure our students succeed. And we want them to succeed because we care about them. We care about their futures. We're also being assessed as professors. And so to make sure our students succeed, we want to give them all the tools. And that means linguistic tools too. So we want to make sure they have access to standard English and can use that and can write that. But when we equate that with the only way to speak or write, that's really the issue. It's saying that in all times you have to do this, and if you don't, you're less than. You don't deserve an opportunity. Someone can be Southern English, New York English, speak Chinese English, or Chicano English. They can speak whatever they like, and they might be the best person to do that chemistry lab with you or to study whatever it is. And that's the thing, is when we say just because of your language you shouldn't have this opportunity. It's really, we're not just trying to help our students at that point. At that point, we're really practicing linguicism or linguistic discrimination, which is part of racism and sexism and classism as well.
And that's where the disconnect is. People outside of linguistics don't think of language as being part of racial, gender, whatever identity we would bring to bear. They don't think about language being a part of that, and it clearly is. And the anecdote of another language is certainly, maybe more obvious, but even one of the things that we're happy that the book was able to do was shed light on how other kinds of language are also subject to discrimination. So, for example, the chapter that's on standard language ideology with respect to American Sign Language, right? So that the deaf community suffers very much the same kind of discrimination because of people's uninformed biases about what it means to be a user of sign language. So, for example, students complaining that a sign language interpreter in the classroom is distracting them. Even sign language users being forced or bullied into using types of sign language that's not necessarily dialectal. Sort of the idea of standard applying there as well. So it cuts across all facets of identity, from ability status to gender, in addition to race and ethnicity.
Yeah, and I think that TikTok is helping introduce a lot of linguists, or reminding us that there are two modalities that we could be speaking of, sign and spoken language, and the fact that there is this amazing community of Black ASL, reminding us all that it's the same in sign. The same thing is happening, and I think that's really important to remember when we're talking about these kind of things. So I think we often erase sign, which I'm learning. Yeah, we definitely do. I learned this through my friends on Twitter.
Including one of the co-authors of that exact article, Dr. John Henner.
Yeah. It's been an education for us as well. I mean, a very welcomed education. I really appreciated the opportunity to have these, issues more obvious so that I could consider them and think about, what my own unconscious biases were. So you brought up standard language ideology. What is that? So standard language ideology is a type of abstract reference to the notion of an ideal. We adopted, Libby Green's book, English with an Accent, has been very influential both for this book and other work in linguistic discrimination. And we adopted her definition of that, which I'll read: a bias toward an abstracted, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant Bloc institutions, and which names as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. So it's this notion of an abstract ideal that we should all be, moving towards, and definitely reflective of a notion of what is considered to be the prestige form of communication in a given setting. And for the particular book that we've put together, it's that of higher education.
Of course, there's a standard in a lot of different things. There's medical terms and terminology and jargon, and there's legalese, right? And we have all of these different things, and higher language uses as its kind of base of communication this standard language, which of course we know historically was just a particular dialect and accent pattern that was chosen because it was used by people in power, and by people that had economic, ability and were able to choose. And of course, then it's reinforced not just by universities, but by the media and by K through 12 and, even by parents and so many things where it is just, oh, that's not how you should say it. You should say it this way, or don't use that particular terminology or syntax here. You should do it this way instead. And it's just, we should be able to figure out a way to say, that's great, and I love the way you express yourselves. Sometimes, though, we need to make sure we're doing things to where lots of different audiences and people with different kinds of Englishes will also understand us. And there's got to be a way to bridge those two things in a way that's comfortable and that honors people and their speech.
What can we do besides burning the whole system down, which is basically what I want to do, which is kind of what we have to do at this point if we want to get away from this standard language ideology. But at this point, we're basically having to, saying that what you bring to the table is perfect. I'm gonna add something to your toolkit by this other way that people are expecting you to speak, and I'm sorry it's this way. Is that like a stepping stone toward us getting to a place where people start perceiving people differently, which is what I think we need to be doing, where we can one day get away from having to kind of force people to code switch?
I think so. I mean, I think we can see that in K through 12. We've had dialect readers for years. Rickford and Rickford did that many years ago and showed how you could transition students in maybe their home dialect and the way that might be structured in a story to a standard English, just to give them that access. So if they want to code switch, they can. And then in situations where they don't need to, they don't have to. But it just seems like there's always going to be this tension. Often people in higher education, because we care about our students, we don't want them to miss out. We feel the need to assess their use of English, and not just in English class, but in every class, right? We feel a need to comment on what they say or how they say it or how they present themselves in an oral presentation or in an essay for class. And it's something that is rooted in a necessity, because we all, an English speaker from Nigeria versus one from China versus one from Russia or here or from Canada, right? We all want to be able to communicate and be intelligible to each other. At the same time, it should be okay, and we should recognize that you might say it a little bit differently than I do. And as long as we can still understand each other, that's okay. But we have this very heavily focused institutionalization of testing, of meeting certain benchmarks, of presenting ourselves in certain ways and presenting our students in certain ways. And standard English is just a huge part of that. And there are examples, absolutely, where we could take former President Barack Obama or former President George Bush or former President Bill Clinton and say they made it to the highest office in the land. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes would still use African-American English in the case of President Obama, and use features or traits of that. Or sometimes George Bush Jr. would certainly sound like a Texan in certain speeches and when giving answers. And we could say, well, it was okay for them, so it must be okay elsewhere. But they were being judged by the entirety of the U.S., people that sounded like them and some people that didn't. And on university campuses, you're often judged by one professor, or if it's a master's or dissertation, a group, a few, a committee. And those people, as with the situation that happened at the university here, might be the people that are the ones in the position of power to give you that internship or recommend you for a research opportunity. Or those are also the people that are going to vote if colleagues should be given tenure and a promotion. And so we do have to kind of figure out a way to say, like you said, it's good to have standard English in your toolkit, and you might want to trot it out at some times, but it shouldn't be the only way that we judge each other for opportunities in education.
One of the points we make in the conclusion of the book is that, standard language ideology is one discourse, right? But there are also counter ideologies as well that can hopefully, combat the notion of that or educate people if they happen to not be informed. And so we're optimistic. And the question about whether or not we want to burn down higher education. I mean,
not higher education, but the standard language ideology.
Right. Okay. Yes. But we tried to take a big tent viewpoint with this book and sort of, let the chapters speak for what they are able in terms of putting out the data that's there and making the argument that they do, but then leave open what people are comfortable with doing with respect to their own belief system. So starting with the individual, right? So one of the points we raised was Vincent Leach has this term called intimate critique, and it invites people to be very self-reflective about their own unconscious internal biases. Maybe they've never examined those particular ideas before because they've never had an opportunity to. So we're hoping that the book at least starts that discussion. And certainly as co-editors, we were in that situation of being educated by our authors' pieces. So we hope that will happen as well beyond. And then, because change has happened, we're optimistic that change can happen. And the way that it's going to happen is going to be up to the way that the institution decides to react. But we hope that language can be added to the roster of things for which discrimination is being fought. We're not there yet. We've got a ways to go. But we hope in the future that will come to pass. So one of the interesting things I learned my university is in Pennsylvania, there's actually a 1990 Act 76, called the English Fluency in Higher Education Act, and it requires universities, state universities in Pennsylvania, to certify a faculty member's fluency in English. There's no context for which English they're talking about. There's no definition of what fluency is, and there's no guidelines for who would be the expert to actually determine whether or not this faculty member is or is not fluent in English. But it's obviously there as a reflection of the notion of what it should be. So hopefully, these kinds of things, because I'm sure Pennsylvania is not the only state that has this kind of measure in place. Hopefully this kind of book can open the door to more discussions about why this should be reconsidered, or at least, be better informed in terms of what it's trying to achieve.
I had to do something like that except for the TAs at ASU. And I was the one who was like, no, they're fine. Like, I can understand them. And the other people were like, no, the parents will be upset if we let this person TA. And I was just like, oh boy, this is a mess. So one of the things that came to mind was like, okay, yes, this is obviously higher ed is, the focus, but you're right. It's not just higher ed, it's everywhere. And we often don't value other varieties, even ones that are just as prestigious. So for example, this comedian was making fun of the Scottish pronunciation of, well, I say scone, but the Scottish pronunciation is scone. And she was just not having it. And she was just like, no, that's garbage. No one should pronounce that way. And I was just like so upset that this is a thing that we can poo-poo like so readily. And it's totally acceptable. And I had to stop following that person on Twitter.
It's one thing, right, to joke about our dialects and our accents and point out the differences in them. It's another to then shut it down and say, no, you shouldn't say that, because everyone has, all the different dialects are here because of all of the historical differences, migration patterns, and who settled this area and what languages they came into contact with. And of course, most of us would be like, oh, we love the Scottish dialect. It sounds so great and it's so wonderful. And there are a lot of great Scottish comedians and British comedians and all other kinds of things. And the great thing about them is that they sound so wonderful because they sound so different. And of course, they all talk about each other, just like American comedians talk about them. And there's this great bit where Eddie Izzard says, something about English and England versus the United States.
Because, language, they do say Britain and America are two countries separated by the Atlantic Ocean. And it's true. Now, they say two countries separated by a common language. That's the line. It's an Oscar Wilde line, I think. And we do pronounce things in a different way. Like you say caterpillar, and we say caterpillar. And now you say aluminum, we say aluminium. You say centrifugal, we say centrifugal. You say leisure, we say leisure. You say basil, we say basil. And you say herbs, and we say herbs. Because there's a fucking H in it.
Can we talk about intelligibility real quick? Because you've mentioned it, and I think the problem that I see is that we're not even talking about intelligibility most of the time. People are shitting on things like double negatives. They're like, you shouldn't do that. And that has nothing to do with intelligibility, if you ask me, because you understand what this person said. You just don't like it.
Or judge, make a judgment about their intelligence, right? I mean, that's another form of, because someone speaks a different variety than you, they're dumb or they're not educated, when that's not the case at all. There's no connection to be made there, but people jump to that conclusion.
That's a great example. I was in between classes at Duke the other day, and I went to the restroom, and the light was off. And that particular building doesn't have the lights that automatically turn on. And in my head, I said to myself, no one's done turned the light on all day, right? Like, that's how I sound in my head to myself, right? And then I was like, they ain't done this either, and nobody's done this. And I was using multiple negatives, and I was sitting there, and I was washing my hands, and I went back to class, and I was like, I'm going to tell my students I just did this, right? Like, in my head, this is what I said, and that's okay. And I'm going to use it as an example of double negatives, and everybody, whether they were from the South or other parts of the United States, one student from Canada, several students from overseas, everybody got it. Nobody was like, everyone says double negatives make a positive. But we know that's not true. It's just emphasis on how negative or how nobody isn't going to do that or something like that. And it is not an issue of intelligibility. Like Marnie said, like you've said, it's just an issue about trying to put someone else down, to say that they're not smart enough, that we know better than they do. And they should have said it this way, and it should have been that way. And this is not new, of course. You can watch that old Great American Tongues from, what was it, the 1980s something. And people are doing the same thing there. And here it's 2021, 40 years later, and we have the same issues, right, with people talking down to someone else because they sound a certain way. And it's not about intelligibility, because most of the people in my classes, most of the people I meet on the street, wherever I am, I can understand them and they can understand me. And so that's really the crux of the issue, is judging someone for their different language and then either opening up opportunities to them because they speak a certain way, or closing off opportunities. And in higher ed, we can do a lot. Like Marnie was talking about, using this book as a way to reflect, reading the chapters and saying, have I done that with a student? Have I treated a colleague this way? Have I paid attention, to how I'm thinking about linguistics and language features and my students' ways of speaking? But certainly we need some administrative and larger institutional buy-in. We need administrators to make linguicism or linguistic discrimination part of Diversity Week. We need to train people in diversity and equity offices. We need to train faculty and staff and admins. We need to tell students, give students the opportunity to share their language experiences and how it's affected them and things like that as well. And then once we do something like that, like two of the chapters talk about, Christina Higgins in Hawaii and Walt Wolfram at NC State, once we begin to do those types of things, we can have that larger discussion of, well, how do we grade? What is the most important thing? How can we begin to change people's needs or perspectives or ideas about this? And like Marnie already said, it might be institution specific, absolutely. But it seems like we can begin to take these ideas presented in the book and move them forward, hopefully within ourselves, within our departments, and then, in the larger institutional setting as well.
So then who would you say in your head, who's holding this book and you're like, yes, I'm glad it got to you?
I would say administrators, the folks who are responsible for diversity policies and, considering ways to be sure that the university that they're, stakeholders at will be adding this to their list of things to consider with respect to, new policies, to be sure people are not being disenfranchised, to be sure that people have the same opportunities, that it's an even playing field. That would be one. Certainly, most folks within the realm of linguistics already know these things. But we're such a niche part of academia. I was just even thinking about the double negative thing. Like, it's true within the science of linguistics that many things about language are formulaic, but certainly the mathematical equation of 2 negatives equal a positive does not apply.
Well, it sometimes does, yes. But it's very obvious that it does. And I would say that it's actually the opposite. It's still mathematical. You're multiplying rather than, or you're adding. It's one or the other, with multiple negatives, and they're both logical.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
And you mentioned that Lippy Green was someone who inspired you, and she's definitely inspiring our book too that we're writing. I think she said something like this was like the last acceptable form of discrimination, and Carrie and I have said it too.
The last backdoor. Yeah, and there's different ways of saying the same idea, but yeah, hers was the last backdoor to discrimination.
I mean, I've pondered this idea for so long, and I'm like, is it because of this like idea of immutable and immutable characteristics? Do people think we can just flip a switch and change the way we speak as if it's not who we are or part of who we are? I mean, I think that some people must really believe that. It's not like skin color that we can we can't change their skin color, but we can change the way we speak. Do you think that that's kind of like one of the things that makes people feel like it's okay to kind of judge people on or to tell people to change?
I think her metaphor of the sound house really works, with respect to a metaphor that kind of speaks to the way that someone's accent is built from early on, and asking them to change it is a very complex request that might be achievable by a very small fraction of individuals who have that affinity, but by and large, it's not gonna result in anybody's real transformation.
So you brought up that show, American Voices from the 80s, and then you also talk about back in 1974, they already were trying to fight standard language ideology. It's almost 50 years later, which makes me feel very old. And yet here we are, still fighting the same fight. I feel frustrated that we're still at the same spot, basically. I mean, it's a little better now than it was. But what can we do to keep pushing this forward, to open more people's minds?
It seems like one of the best things we can do is constantly kind of call it out, right? We can say, hey, that's not okay. There was a story, I don't know if you guys saw it, it was on the NBC News the other day, and I'll pull it up quickly while I'm talking. There was a county councilwoman in, I think, Maryland, and they were doing a virtual kind of meeting, and members of the public were on there and things like that. And she happens to be a Hispanic woman. And at one point she pronounced a certain word some way, and people then started talking and putting in the chat about what she had said. And, oh, isn't that cute? She pronounced that wrong, and things like that. And then she just came back. The word she said was, one of the men on the Zoom, I guess, that laughed at her says, I heard the word hologram and thought that was kind of interesting. And another woman was like, so cute. So she says, we still have situations in public where people are constantly pointing out that we don't sound like they do, or that we have the accent, whereas we know everybody has an accent and a dialect. But what she did was, she went on to some local stations and she said, I want other Hispanics to be proud of the way they sound, and I want people to, like their accents and things. So someone who's, if it happens to you, kind of coming back and responding to it has got to be one of the best things we can do. Although, again, probably for 50 years, people have been doing that. And so that's why we feel the buy-in from administrators and department chairs and heads and deans and things like that is so important, because we can't really change the culture, right, of a university or of many areas if we don't have that kind of larger support and buy-in. One of the things we are encouraged by is the very quick adoption of asking people, what's your pronoun? And putting it maybe with your email, or asking students, if you want to be called a certain thing, let me know, in an email or after class or on a note card if I give it to you. But really letting people know. And a lot of people in the university system, because it's not just language, it's language and gender. And so it seems easier to adapt to that. When we're just thinking about language in the classroom, we don't always consider the other ways in which we might be, the term in the book is ratiolinguistics, how we might be calling out students or not expecting much of them because of the way they sound to us, or how we don't give them the same sort of time and attention because we don't think that their dialect makes them, in a sense, worthy. And that's really terrible, because, as you said, it's really part of our identity. And what we're doing when we attack the way someone speaks or attach certain stereotypes to the way they speak is we're putting those stereotypes on the person, and we're putting those ideas on our students or on our colleagues or on people just that we meet in the street. And so it's a very negative thing. And Lippy Green is mostly right in the fact that it's not okay to body shame anymore. It's not really okay in the wider public to say things about people's race or about their gender. And when people do, they're often called out and called down. But we can still make a lot of fun of the way someone talks, or the way you talk, or the way I talk. And it's done a lot, and people don't say, hey, that's not okay. Because intelligence is attached to the way we sound and the words we use and how we present ourselves, right? Through speech and through the written medium. And so there's this attachment that says, oh, well, you're obviously not smart enough, you don't need this. But it really does matter for people to speak up and speak out. And it's been 50 years since the 4 Cs and NCTE kind of adopted those, really trying to recognize home languages and trying to, be understanding of students' dialects in the classroom. But even they walk that fine line, because they say, we need to transition students to standard English so that at least for the classroom they have that ability. Elsewhere, it shouldn't matter. But we see that elsewhere it does matter for so many people. And just kind of inserting yourself and saying, hey, that's not okay. Or it's difficult, though, because the power relationships at universities are often very stark. So someone's a student and someone else is a tenured distinguished professor. And the professor comments on the way that you said something, not what you said, but how you said it. How is that student then supposed to react? Probably the student's embarrassed. Maybe they're frustrated. Who do they go to? The professor who is going to grade them, right? There's a lot of skin in the game there, right? So
we get into the issue of the Pygmalion effect then, where okay, if the ratiolinguistic the issue of ratiolinguistics and Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores, who came up with that, the idea that the way you look, you're going to speak a certain way, and so I'm going to have these assumptions when I walk into the classroom about you, and then all of a sudden, I'm not going to expect much of you, and then you might then perform poorly because you're like, this person doesn't give a shit about me. So these are real, tangible consequences. These show up in grades. And then they absolutely follow the student, right? And how does that make them feel about themselves? And, you can be the most badass person in the world and want to say that things don't affect you, but these things affect you.
I mean, very much in the same way all the research about other kinds of discrimination have revealed, it's the very same type of dynamic. And we were talking about, hope, who do we hope actually reads this book or is influenced by it besides administrators? Clearly professors, even if they start small and start to craft assignments where they permit students to explore and use whatever their home varieties of language are. And also to even remind people about the fact that using a written standard for spoken English really doesn't make, talk about logic, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. They're two different delivery systems. And so it's fine. It's fine to have standards. There's no problem with that. But when it starts to represent who a person is and it starts to denigrate somebody else because they're not part of that circle, then we have a problem. Gail knows this better than I do, but the example of the dissertation that was wrapped a few years back, to sort of expand genres in such a way that, other varieties besides standard English can be used is a really good idea. And then we also hope that students who've experienced this kind of discrimination can somehow read about other people's experiences so that they can identify that, oh, that's what that was, rather than just feeling bad like it's only on their shoulders, to realize that there's a much bigger power play going on here that they're not responsible for.
So I have a friend here who oversaw a master's project in language revitalization, and the student did the project completely orally. It was a completely oral master's thesis, and it was all done in his community. So his supervisors had to, go to the community and watch. And it was just a very different kind of thesis. Obviously, the fact that it was in a different language was more acceptable because of the nature of it. But still, that is very unusual. And we do need to break out of our very boring written standard English way of thinking.
Imagine an argument built on call and response, that's used in Black English vernacular. That would be such an inspiring, set of ideas to listen to.
So one of the last things that we wanted to touch on was the fact that, at least in some ways, higher ed is pretty liberal, pretty progressive. It's not always, but it's pretty. Why is language discrimination still occurring in an environment that is, definitely more liberal than some other parts of society?
It seems like there's this, when we have an idea about disseminating knowledge and being the gatekeepers, right, of some set of knowledge, whatever your program and department is, there's this idea that knowledge then needs to be given back to you in a very specific way. So talking about A.D. Carson's, I think he was at Columbia, and he wrote like a rap record, right, for his thing. The research is all still there. The understanding is all still there, but giving that back to us, or giving us an oral, right, dissertation in the community in which the dissertation is about, and making it a really interesting new thing. It's because institutions of higher learning are so grounded in all of these very specific modes, right, and very specific parameters. And this is how it's always been done, so that's how we're still going to do it. And I think if we go back to what I said earlier, where students really, educators really want their students to succeed. And we know, for the most part, to go out there and get that job and impress that hiring manager, you need to dress the part and you need to kind of talk the part, right? So if you use African American English or Southern English, or I don't know, Italian New York English or Valley Girl from California, you might not sound the part. Someone's listening to you and they're saying, I don't know if I want this person representing my company. Or is this professional sounding, right? Is this going to get people to want to be a part of me? There are certainly a lot of companies and institutions that have been able to play up on the fact that they use a particular dialect. And that has really served them well. But for the majority of college students, that's not particularly the case. If you want to go work at a bank and you did finance as a major, they're going to expect you to be able to talk to all different kinds of people, and they want you to have that more standard sounding accent or dialect, so that way everyone can understand you, and they're hoping, of course, you'll be able to understand everyone else. But it really is about that kind of, we're the gatekeepers for these degrees, and we're the gatekeepers of knowledge, and there's a way that I was taught, and I'm going to teach you in a similar way, or even if we teach in new ways, we often assess students in very similar ways back. And if we tell our students, you can use whatever communicative style you like, whatever mode, whatever variety on campus, and then they get out in the real world and they see that's not the case, have we then done them a disservice? Have we not prepared them? And so there's a lot of fear there, right? That we are worried about how they will fare when they leave us. So even if we want to be liberal and progressive, we know everyone else isn't. And so we kind of have to say, like Megan said earlier, like put this in your toolkit because you really might need that. And you might need it here, and you're certainly going to need it when you leave here. And so I think most people realize that higher education is kind of this bubble, and the rest of the world is not that way. And so many of us still use standard English in class. I use my own Southern English as examples for my students, but I don't generically talk to my students that way. I use standard English, right? It's what's expected. It's what the students are expecting, and I give them what they expect. Maybe I'm part of the problem, right? But that just kind of, it's a cyclical thing, and it's really hard to get off, because if you get off and you let your students do something different, maybe no one else will. Then they're going to be downgraded elsewhere or not given those opportunities. And so we just kind of stay with the system and the status quo that we've got, because it seems, what are we going to do for a generation of students? The same thing's being questioned in education about the pandemic. What are we doing with these students in online? Are they going to be able to catch back up? Are they progressing properly? If we do the same thing with language and just said, free for all, do whatever you want in colleges, then is that the best thing for our students? That's a hard question to say definitively 100% yes to, because they're going to leave us and go elsewhere and be judged.
And think about the status quo is not working right now for many students. And I can't help but think of the example of Yamiche Alcindor and Tucker Carlson, where Tucker Carlson on his show played a clip of Yamiche, who is a black woman, and he said something like, I couldn't even understand her or something. And by all accounts, she was speaking standardized English, mainstream white English even, you might, and so it goes back to that radiolinguistic concept that we see her and we just expect her to not be speaking a certain way.
Or you don't want to accept that person, whether it's economics, whether it's race, whether it's class, whether it's region of the country. different political views. So you automatically are shutting the person down on all of these, and then you use language as an extra way to shut them down.
It's like profiling. It's a way of profiling.
Yeah, it's just an excuse. Even when there's nothing there, like in this case, there was nothing there for them for him to pick up on, other than the way that she looked.
And there's plenty of research that demonstrates that people's, inherent biases play into what they think they perceive or understand, as opposed to what is actually comprehensible. So that idea of intelligibility is not necessarily, it's not an objective measure, right? There's a lot of subjectivity to that. If we can somehow manage, the change should come from within. It should change from individuals. It should change from top down as well. That would be great. I don't think that's going to be likely the way it does happen, but if we can just get people to understand that difference is not deficient, right? That's one of the themes in our book, is that difference is difference. It's not deficient. And allowing different types of expression within certain contexts is actually to the betterment of all of us. It actually enhances things as opposed to taking something away. It doesn't mean you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
All right. Well, we always leave our listeners with one final thought.
Don't be an
asshole.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being with us
Thank
today.
you.
Thanks.
We would like to thank our newest patrons, Jacqueline Mogul, Jacob Bloom, and Catherine Remlinger. So thank you so much. If anyone else wants to join us at patreon.com/vocalfriespod, that would be great. We have stickers and we have bonus episodes once a month. So join us at patreon.com. The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.